Ahead of International Women's Day, welcome to this special broadcast, a We the Women partnership with the Employee Resource Group for Women at a LinkedIn. And we are asking that most fundamental of questions that confront women everywhere in the world, no matter who you are. How do you get beyond the bias and the barriers that obstruct your everyday dreams and aspirations? And in a moment from now, I'll be introducing three women from the Asia Pacific region who have led by examples and offered inspiration to millions around the globe. Let's bring our guests up on this special broadcast today. As I said, a We the Women partnership with Women at LinkedIn. From Australia, late at night, so we're really thankful to her for accommodating her evening, is Julia Newton House. She's the CEO of Investing in Women, a special program of the Australian government that looks at how to, in a sense, encourage more female led companies and organizations. Here in India, from Bangalore, an old friend of We the Women, a personal friend of mine, Kiran Shaw, chairperson of Biocon, and easily the foremost business, among the foremost business leaders of India. And it's a pleasure to see you again, Kiran. And from Singapore today, we are joined by Grace Kerrison, who heads the sales solutions for the APAC region at LinkedIn. Welcome to all of you. And let me start with you, Kiran. I know there are going to be a lot of questions and comments, so I'm going to try and keep this as interactive as possible. But I'm not sure how many people in the Asia Pacific region or globally know that you had quite a different dream when you started out. You actually wanted to brew beer, and you even studied sort of the expertise and the know-how how to do it, and then you faced an obstruction because you were a woman and nobody thought that women should be brewing beer, but you managed to convert your disadvantage into an advantage. So can you share that little accident of fate and how you owned that moment?
Thank you, Barkha, and it's great to be on your show as always. Let me start by wishing everyone a happy Women's Day, International Women's Day tomorrow. Um, to answer your question, I often joke, Barkha, that I became an entrepreneur because of a gender bias, and that gender bias actually started in India after I returned from Australia. I did the very sort of unusual and atypical thing of pursuing a career in brewing. And I went to Australia to study brewing science in Ballarat in Victoria. And I just thought I'd set myself up for a great career in brewing, only to be rudely shocked when I came back to India because I was told that, it's difficult to hire women in this kind of career. So it was an accidental encounter with an Irish biotech entrepreneur that got me to start Biocon, my company, which has, of course, since been a great journey for me because I've been able to build it as India's largest biopharmaceutical enterprise.
And it's fantastic that you managed to convert your disadvantage into an advantage. But when you were first sort of had to face that first rejection, Kiran, and some of these graphic slides are telling us what a number of women have to go through. How did you find that strength to remain optimistic? Because after all, this conversation is about getting beyond bias and barriers.
Well, I think I was quite self confident and determined, having been the only woman student in Australia. And I'm sure Julia will agree with me that Australia is not exactly a great place for women pursuing careers either, not in the 70s for sure. And, having grown up or educated myself and learned how to fend for myself as the only woman in my program, I think gave me a lot of spunk. I came back to India. Of course, I was very disappointed. I was angry. I was very despondent. But I think I wanted to do something with my life. And I'd actually looked for a job in brewing outside India. But, fate had other plans for me. And this accidental encounter with an Irish biotech entrepreneur got me to change course. And I thought, well, okay, I might have to not pursue a brewing career, but at least I'm pursuing an entrepreneurial career and let's see where it takes me. So I think it was that courage I had and that sense of defiance that I had to prove to those who had refused to hire me that maybe I could show that I could run a business, I could manage a business.
And it's so interesting that you use the word defiance. But since you spoke about your Australian experience, let me bring in Julia, who, by the way, was sharing with us just as we started this conversation that there's actually a street in Australia named after Kiran. And I actually had no idea. And that is just so interesting, Julia. Where is this street? I mean, Kiran would know, but I'm sure you know too.
It's in Ballarat, in the university that Kieran attended. So I think that's fabulous.
It is fabulous. But Julia, you are investing, putting money in a sense where your mouth is. And we all know the disparity between men and women when it comes to getting access to capital. And I'll ask Kiran to talk a little bit about that in a moment because, not being able to become a brewer of beer was not the only obstacle she faced. Capital was another one, and I'm sure Julia, you either have experienced that or know many women who have, which is why you're now literally investing in women.
Sure, Barker. And, my first career was as a research scientist. And, it was interesting listening to Kieran because actually I moved away from science because I found the male, it was just a very male dominated space in the sciences areas I was working. And it was just very oppressive. So anyway, I've ended up doing many other interesting things, so lucky me. But I think in terms of the work, with this Australian government initiative in Southeast Asia, um, we're working in a number of areas, but in terms of working with entrepreneurs, so the finance sector is very male dominated. And men kind of think women are a risk, right? So if men are making the decisions about who gets financing, and they look at women and they think, maybe she's going to get pregnant, and what does that mean for her business? So there's actually some really interesting research that shows investors, and actually female investors and male investors, view women as a higher risk. They tend to ask women all the sort of downside questions. How will you cope if this happens? Whereas when they're interviewing male entrepreneurs, they'll ask all the upside questions like, how far can you drive this business, and get very excited. So in the end, men are much more likely to get funded. And then if they get funded, they'll get higher levels of funding. So we've helped set up 10 different funds in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam that are specifically targeting women entrepreneurs, but they're working with impact investors and a range of both global and local impact investors. So it's about really many of these investors say, no, we don't have bias. So we are committed to working with them to look through all their systems so that they actually do see where bias exists within the systems. We need to change that and then fund women. And so I think it's really exciting that we're doing that.
But let me, before I come to Grace, just take this back to Kiran. Two sets of facts are simultaneously true. That women do not have the same access to capital as men. The data bears it out. That women often get asked about marriage and motherhood plans, and men do not get asked about marriage and fatherhood plans is true. But it is equally true that in many parts of the world, the number of women working is declining. It doesn't look like that from the number of women who are in the headlines, women like yourselves. But in India, for example, the female labor force participation is actually declining. And many women, especially after COVID, are not returning to the workforce. So, Kiran, share your own journey about how tough it was for you to get access to capital to start what a company that eventually catapulted you to billionaire status is one of the most successful companies in the world. How tough was it to get the capital to start it, Kiran?
Julia actually raised some very, very important points about how you are viewed as a woman entrepreneur in terms of a risk of lending to. And I can tell you that that was my biggest, sort of challenge that I had to overcome because I was high risk as in terms of access to capital. I was high risk as an employer trying to recruit talent. And I was high risk because I was trying to start a business in biotechnology that nobody understood. So I was a high risk all around. But I think Julia makes a very important point. The kind of questions that a woman is asked is so derogatory. It has very little to do with the business, more to do with her personal life. And when it comes to a man, it's all to do with the business. And she's absolutely right. The point is that the man not only gets favored, but gets a much bigger funding than most women can get. So I just think that we need to be, this is a very serious issue about access to capital. And I think women must be looked at seriously. And I think women must be heard in terms of their business aspiration. I think we have to bust some of those myths that women are not ambitious, women are not risk takers, women don't think big. These are some of the other credibility challenges that women have to overcome, and in a very unfair way. I mean, I've busted every one of those myths. I've been the biggest risk taker. I've, basically thought very big, and I'm very ambitious. So I think, we need to really get the investors to be fair about how they judge women. And that will only happen when, uh, you see more women succeeding in businesses.
What's the biggest risk you took? Sorry, Grace, I'm coming to you in just a moment, but what's the biggest risk you took? Because you said I'm the biggest risk taker.
Yeah, I mean, even recently, the risk I took in getting into biosimilar drugs. I
Yeah.
mean, the regulatory pathway had not even been scripted in the US and Europe, and I was trying to target those markets as my eventual markets. And I just followed the science, and I invested big time in developing biosimilars years before the biosimilar guidelines had been drawn up. So that was a big risk I took, because that's why other companies did not want to take that risk, and they all got left behind.
Yeah. Grace, looked at from a sort of organizational perspective as somebody who's actually dealing with attrition, with a lopsided sort of workforce balance when it comes to men and women, and the data bears this out everywhere. What has been your own experience, first personally, and then how do you take that experience into what kind of policy you would like to see framed, as someone who has a voice in what that policy should be?
Right. Hello, everyone. Firstly, happy International Women's Day. I also just want to touch on what both Julia and Karen had just outlined, specific to women, especially returning after starting a family. I think this is where data really is important. And there's a recent data that was published by Non by Non, which is co-founded by two women who have been in the region for the last 30 plus years. And it actually shows that women are more likely to be more committed to business growth than personal growth if they're actually given the chance after having a family. And so I think, what I'm trying to say here is there's data and insights that could help, I suppose, break that bias on what needs to change. And that really is one of the things that, as far as my own experiences is how you as a female Asian that grew up in Canada, moved to New Zealand, and then moved to Australia. There were, I suppose, lots of ceilings that I probably had to be broken, because there were very few Asian females at the time in technology. So Kieran spoke about in the 70s as far in science, but I think even in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were very few female technologists or women in sales. And if I were to look at my experience in 2005, I was the first female account director in the company that I was working for, and diversity and inclusion, was just starting there. But I saw some female leaders that that are moving up the ranks, but it was very few. Not to even mention some women of color How it's in a very similar way as far as it really took perseverance, commitment, hard work to show your potential and to have other leaders recognize that potential and give you that opportunity. And as I, throughout my career, early in my career anyway, that was because that was my experience
Yeah.
around, how do I have that allyship from other female leaders, but also male leaders who see my potential versus my current or my lived experience at the time.
Can I ask you, what is the most sort of sexist uh, thing or comment, Grace, you had to encounter at the workplace in this professional journey of yours?
Sure. And this is something that we speak about openly, within LinkedIn around microaggression, because that means different things to different people. But did you know that by asking where you're from is, depending on the context, is a form of microaggression. And I remember when I first moved to New Zealand, and I walked into to an agency and I started to speak, and they were really surprised. And they actually said, "Wow, you speak really good English." And again, it's just because they don't see many Asian women, probably from Canada,
Yeah.
that spoke English. But to me, it's just one minimal example, but there were many of them, whether
Yeah.
it's in the workplace or personally.
Well, Indians, men and women, by the way, have to face that comment, that rather patronizing comment wherever we go. Julia, the first of our comments is coming in. How do you promote allyship in the workplace, especially allyship from men? And I'd like you to take that, and then I'll take it to Kiran as well.
Well, first of all, there's a huge economic case for this, right? I mean, there is very clear data that diverse teams are more innovative, that they manage risk better. Companies with diverse leadership outperform their peers who are dominated by one gender or the other. So I think we need, that needs to be out there loud and clear, but then leadership matters. So, I mean, if the leadership of the company you're working for does not acknowledge or deal with sexual harassment, is not promoting women, you need to look for another job. But where for women who are determined to get to the top and want to change companies, leadership matters. The next point, I think, is the data, getting the analysis and seeing where and how women and men are within the company. And open communications, communicate about a vision of why and what gender equality in the workplace is, and take that forward. I think it's exciting that there's more and more consumer demand and community demand for workplace gender equality and diversity more broadly, and that is driving large companies to change. But then it does come down to leadership, data and analytics, so that you know where you're doing well and where you need to change, and strong communication with staff and with your external stakeholders about what you're doing and why.
Let me bring in Kiran now. It's interesting that Julia mentioned how she was a research scientist and she left that space. If we were to look particularly at the healthcare space, I was looking at some data yesterday that tells us, Kiran, that 70% of the global healthcare workforce is made up by women, but only 25% leadership positions are actually held by women. So, if you look at this and you look at the pandemic, the fact that we're just emerging from the shadows of this pandemic, that gap is really staggering. And separately, a Yale University survey tells us that on average, Yale found that male scientists, for no good reason, earned an average of $4,000 more than women every year. How do you, as a leader in this sort of healthcare space, among all your other interests, how do you explain this gap? Kiran, we need to unmute
Um,
Kiran. Yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Kiran.
so Barkha, I think, of course, it depends how you slice and dice that data, but nevertheless, I think the overarching data is very clear that there is a funnel effect when it comes to leadership, and that's something all organizations are trying to address. Okay. I just think that we need to sort of ensure that we actually focus on women in leadership roles. And I think men have a very important role to play in leadership development. And I think when you talked about a male ally, I always say that, we need to sensitize men about, giving women a chance, an opportunity. I think women need to be given that opportunity to present, an opportunity to run a project or lead a project, an opportunity to take on more responsibilities, an opportunity to speak about what she has done on handling a certain project or a responsibility. I think that actually gives women a lot more courage and confidence to start seeing themselves in a leadership role. Very often in a team meeting, I find women are very shy to speak up. They don't participate. It's all the men, taking all the decisions, giving their ideas, and saying we should do this and we should do that. And the women generally kind of back off. And I often tell men, you must give women. In fact, I draw out the women, but It's not about me. It's about when you have a meeting. I think men need to draw out ideas from women, opinions from women, and give women an opportunity to present their point of view. Um, I often ask women after the meeting, why didn't you speak up? And do you have anything to say? Did you have another point of view? And often they tell me what they thought. And I said, that doesn't help, because if you keep quiet at a meeting, no one's going to hear your point of view. So I think women themselves also need to speak up, and men need to give an opportunity to women and empower them and enable them to speak up. That
There's an
really starts creating a culture of mutual respect and a sort of a true gender equal team. So I think that's what it's about. And when it comes to sort of pay parity amongst the men and women, I think most organizations do try to address pay parity. I know in our company it's about equal pay for equal jobs and all the rest of it. But I think, when it comes to promotions, when it comes to increments, men fight for it much more than women. And that's why I
there's
think,
actually, I'm jumping in there because there's a question, Kiran, that relates to that, and I think Grace wants to jump in after that. Richa Sinha says, truth be told, women still face the gender credibility gap. It's so much harder for women, in quotes, to prove their worth. Do you agree, Kiran?
yeah, I think we've all, I think Julia also talked about it, and Grace talked about it, and I talked about it. There is a huge perceptible credibility hurdle that we all have to cross, right? It is that much harder for women. We should start with that. But today, Barka, I want to make a statement. I think women actually should realize that they have a huge advantage, because I think, ESG has brought the spotlight on DEI. Every organization wants to be seen that it's doing the right thing. They're going to be judged not by the number of women that they have in the organization, but women at leadership roles. So everything is going well for them. I think they should take full advantage of these opportunities, and I'm sure organizations will be
So you're
welcoming.
saying that this pressure right now, and a appropriate pressure, overdue pressure on companies to be more diverse and inclusive, is a moment in time for women to actually say, okay, you've had to fight historically, but here the doors are opening. Walk
Yeah.
through them. Walk through the
I
door.
think so. I think so. Because it was much tougher, I can tell you, for all three of us
Yeah.
in the yesteryears than it is today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But there was an interesting question about what happens to women after they become parents or get married, and that brings me, Grace, to one of my favorite questions that doesn't get enough play, I think, in public attention: equality at home. Till there is equality at home, there can be no equality at work. Women are forever under pressure to perform multiple roles, which has been romanticized as the superwoman effect, which, by the way, just means that women are doing more than men. And somewhere to try and address this, Melinda Gates once told me that at her foundation, they have family leave, not maternity leave alone, but family leave, so that men can also be urged to take on responsibilities at home, including child rearing. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's true that it has come a long way as far as diversity, inclusion, and belonging, or DI, or DIBS. But it has to go past the metrics. I agree with you that more and more companies now are encouraging family leave, so both, male and female. From a company perspective, just going back to what Kieran, has mentioned, I think there's also a need to recognize that one size doesn't fit all. And what I mean by this is, we know that diverse teams win and innovate more often. And there's lots of studies and research on that. And I see that even in my own team. However, there's diversity, and then there's inclusion, and then there's the belonging. And to me, it's the getting past the metrics of D&I and really focusing on the B, which is belonging. And this needs to happen both at the work front and on the home front. And what I mean by that on the work front, on the belonging, is we know that when people feel that they can be themselves, that they're accepted for who they are, they do their best work. And that would be the same thing as far as having that conversation at home. From a leadership perspective, the conversation I often have, having worked for global companies that are not headquarters here, is that talent is not the same as far as how they act or how it's perceived in a one market like a North America, as an example. That talent and capabilities in Asia, you need to have like that cultural and that regional nuances as well. So to me, it's really up to the leader themselves to actually drive like that inclusion and belonging. So in meetings, it's recognizing that, hey, have you actually gone through, instead of giving women the opportunity, it's about how do you make sure every lens or every person's point of view, has been received. But I do realize that, there are a lot of women that are very quiet in meetings. And to me, it's about keeping in mind, Ruth Baden Ginsburg used to say, speak your mind, even if your voice shakes. And that is the one thing that I've done over time, over and over again throughout my career.
Julia, Madeleine Albright famously said there's a special place in hell reserved for women who don't support other women. And there's a comment on that, or a question. Any thoughts on the fact on why women don't support other women, be it in the workplace or otherwise? Hang on. You're on mute. Can we unmute Julia? Yeah.
I totally agree with Madeleine Albright. There is a special place in hell reserved for those women, but some women are getting on. Some women are supporters of the patriarchy. They're doing just fine, or they think, well, I fought for this, so you fight too. And some women just like to be on their own. So, not everyone is going to be an ally. But we are growing the group of allies. We're growing the number of people who are committed to this. And so, what do you do about those women? I'm not sure I have any recipe for change for them. But it is about all of us not being bystanders, but being active in calling women into the conversation, calling diverse women into the conversation. My experience is as an able-bodied, cisgendered white woman, and I know that many other women have had a much bigger set of issues to address in terms of discrimination and bias. But We've done a lot of surveys of millennials in Southeast Asia. And I think one of the things that I would like to say, pertaining to your last question, that's really interesting is that from this data, it suggests that men are much more willing to share childcare than to share wage earning. They want to continue to be men see part of their masculinity as being the key breadwinner, the key earner in the family. And so what we see from young women is that actually they really want to they want financial and economic independence. They want to go out and earn a living. Men don't want to let them. They want their wife to be the secondary earner who is primarily responsible for making sure they have dinner, the children are well looked after, so that their career can be successful.
I mean, I just want to say that men are also products of the same socialization that women are. And, Susan Faludi had a very good book on this 2 decades ago called Stiffed, which actually look at how men trying to break out of the stereotype are also judged. So let's also make that point about men. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. And talking about men, Kiran, there's a kind of contrarian and contentious question in our audience from a man, and I thought it was very interesting from Ketan Bhagat, who says, how can you say that the finance sector at least is more biased towards men? If you look at India, NSC, ICICI, and Axis Bank have had women at the top. And the short point, because the question is very long, is that all of these women have found themselves at the heart of controversies, been accused of corruption, most recently the NSC. So I think the suggestion somehow is that how do you separate what is empirically true for any professional, male or female, from the fact that women sometimes do get judged in a different way from men for actually the same misdemeanor or even the same misjudgment or sometimes even the same crime? Kiran.
Yeah, I think it's not a fair question because I think that, if you just, get the spotlight on a handful of women and say, okay, this is what happened to this woman and that woman, and don't take it in the broader context of, say, men and women playing these roles, I think it's not fair to, jump to such conclusions and talk about ethics. I mean, ethics is something that applies to any leader, no matter whether you're a man or a woman, and that's a general question you
Mhm.
have to ask. I mean, what this question seems to indicate, and again, there's a gender bias in there. Should we not be talking about gender and ethics? You are detracting from the main discussion. Okay. Secondly, I think yes, no one is. I mean, I always hold up the India's finance sector as saying we've had some of the strongest business leaders in the financial sector in India, where at one time the leading banks used to be all have women at the helm, and they were great change makers. Whatever, I don't want to get into the controversy, but I think we've had great bankers who are women who have actually driven change, and that's
Yeah.
another thing that women have brought to the to leadership. I think women are far resistant to change than men are. I think men come with a lot of baggage. They don't want they don't accept change that easily. And in this day and age, we need adaptability, agility, and change. And I think women have shown that they're far more form a far bigger change makers than men are. So anyway, I just want to say that you're bound to see uh, these kind of leadership issues at a mass scale, but there are very few women at these levels. So to call them out and say that, oh, do you think women are have to be now judged on ethics, is not
Yeah.
fair. Yes, we've had some crazy, the recent NSE leader has the woman leader has come up with some bizarre leadership and governance issues. But I'm sure if you actually look into how many men have governance and leadership issues, they will outnumber the number of women.
And
So
yet it's the women who will get listed in the way that the questioner just did.
yeah,
And but that's why I took the question, because I think one
yeah,
should not shy away from taking the question,
it's a
because this
loaded
happens a
question
lot.
again.
It's a loaded question, but it happens a lot that you pick up, the way you microscopically
So that
scrutinize
is
women.
why a woman is scared to do anything wrong, because the moment a woman is seen to be doing something wrong, they pounce on her, and that makes it all the more difficult for women to assume leadership roles. So for instance, they'll say, look, so and so did this, so is it safe to have a woman leading a bank again? I'm just saying that could also be a very misogynistic way of looking at these kind of incidents.
I think that's a very important point. Now, I want to, we've got 10, 15 minutes left. So I want to actually hear something personal from all three of you. We've spoken a lot about policy and all of that. Kiran, borrow from your own sort of lived life and tell us, what have you found the toughest about being where you are even today? Is there still something that's tough? Do you still feel, even today judged in a way that your male counterparts who lead companies are not?
Yeah, I'm afraid, there is a lot of gender bias when it comes to judging women who are business leaders. You know, is she too soft? Um, is she first they ask you, are you a risk taker? Then when you take a risk, is she taking on too much of a risk? Is she, does she know what she's doing? These are some of the questions that will be asked of a man will never be asked of a woman leader. I mean, today I've made the biggest bet on acquiring a big business. And I think some of the questions I've been asked are, have you over leveraged yourself? And I'm saying, hey, hello. I said, I'm not over leveraged. And why don't you ask the same questions to many, many men who are super over
Yeah.
leveraged?
Yeah, I think no matter how much you achieve, there will be a differentiation in how you are responded to. There's a question, Grace. This is a question from men who are allies. What work is needed from men on negating the unconscious bias about gender?
Okay, great. I think firstly, it's all of us need to recognize and acknowledge that we all have our biases. You can take bias out of a machine, but you can't take biases out of women. And I think from an allyship perspective, and again, I'm speaking from a leadership aspect, is that leaders for leadership team meetings really need to allocate the time and the space to have a conversation and have a common language on what is DEI. As an example, at LinkedIn, we have regular conversations around our own experiences on where we're coming from the lens of what is privilege, what is our social identity, what is microaggression, um, what is intent versus impact. Because unless you understand that and you actually make the time to have that conversation, that diverse teams that you now have or that you're trying to attract and retain isn't going to be there because they're not going to feel like they belong. And from an allyship perspective, from your question, Barca, is that's from, whether you're an individual ally, a male ally, or any kind of ally, is you've got to have that view of just being able to learn and understand, because DEI is actually it's actually a journey of learning and growth to be a better person. And at least that's that journey that we're in right now, that my leadership team and I are in at LinkedIn, is at the end of those conversations, we're closer together, we have a better understanding, and our view is we're all work in progress, but we are becoming better humans.
I mean, I think it's also important, Julia, possibly to acknowledge that none of us have definitive answers, and our own politics, our own opinions, also keep shifting, and everything shifts around us. There are generational differences in how to look at the same thing. Some of us are workaholics. There are others down the generations who don't feel like that. So it's a constantly shifting conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's actually quite exciting because, I feel that I was a child in a generation where women stayed at home and had children. But my mother wanted me to go to university, and I saw how important economic and financial independence was and fought for it. But but my daughter, has a very different worldview. And I do feel that the millennial generation and subsequent generations are much more committed to diversity. And both men and women are willing to walk away from workplaces where that doesn't exist. So all of us, who are older in more senior roles can really nurture those generations coming through. But this is a constantly shifting. It's different between different sectors in the economy, different parts, different cultures play a role. But we can learn a lot from that diversity, right? And really thinking about what works and why.
Yeah. Okay. I know Kiran has to leave a bit early and it's late for Julia in Australia. So let's get closing comments, maybe from all three of you, or at least from Kiran, and then I'll come to Grace and Julia. Kiran, if there's one thing you've had to unlearn, I always like to ask women, what would you tell your 18-year-old self? So let me ask you that, is there something you've learned along the way? You had a very different view of maybe, a few decades ago that today you think of very differently.
Well, I just think that, many aspects of, overcoming credibility remains the same. So I don't think you can unlearn those lessons. I just want women to know that, of course, times are very different. It's not as hard as it was when I started a business. So I always encourage women saying it's much easier to start a business today. It's much easier to overcome credibility hurdles today. So go for it.
Okay, Grace and Julia, if you want to quickly add to that. Julia, I'll start with you.
What would I like to unlearn? I spent too much of my early career suffering from imposter syndrome, really thinking, how did I get here? Can I really do this? And I think I would go back and say, believe in yourself. And actually, most people in the room are probably suffering from imposter syndrome. And if they're not, they should. So, just kind of have a bit more faith and I think I replaced that by anger, right? Really a feeling that acknowledging that that too many people who didn't deserve promotions were getting them, and it was time to stand up and change things.
Grace?
Just adding on to what Julia said is, imposter syndrome is definitely on top, but it's, again, I go back to believing that your voice matters. And as I said, is even if it shakes, speak your mind, because you have something to say and that you count.
Okay, this has been a really interesting conversation across 3 countries, but in some ways, many of the things we've picked up are actually universal. I know we're having this conversation across time zones with 3 extremely busy women. So we thank you for your time and your flexibility. To Kiran, I think, who left a comment that she had to really rush off, so she left a couple of minutes early. Thank you, Kiran Shaw. Julia, thank you for accommodating us late this evening. And Grace, thank you also for shifting your schedule and making this space. And thank you, everybody who tuned in. I know this is an ongoing conversation with no definitive boxes, labels, and easy answers, but at least we're having the conversation, and that's what counts. Once again, this is a special We the Women broadcast in partnership with ERG Women at LinkedIn, and we thank you for your participation in this critical conversation and hope to have many more of these conversations. Thank you for watching, and a happy International Women's Day. Take care. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.